I'm Claudine Wong, joining you from the San Francisco Bay Area. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined now by Mei Lee, who's coming to us from Long Beach, longtime journalist, 30 years in the field, host of the podcast, The Mei Lee Show, talking about all things related to the Asian American community and issues there. Mei, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So lots to talk about. In the big picture, there's been a lot of discussion about hate crimes on the rise. There was an FBI report that talked about how many more people not only are experiencing hate crimes or racism or just taunts or other people. We've had the extremes of obviously Midland, Texas, where we've seen stabbings, and then helplines who are from people reaching out saying, I'm worried. And I've heard from people saying, well, how big of an issue is this? And is this really happening all over the country, or are these a few isolated incidents where people are just behaving badly?
Yeah, the answer would be no. This is not just a rare occurrence. We keep on hearing every day. And, on my partner, Shark is the leading online Asian news source. And the show that we do together talks about these Asian issues. And this is the biggest one right now, because why? We're getting inundated on a daily basis with hundreds of stories from people, either about their fear or about actual incidents of verbal assaults or physical assaults taking place. And this is happening everywhere. It's not, some people think, oh, it's just random in like podunk areas of America. No, this is happening in the biggest cities in New York, in LA, in San Francisco, Chicago, and around the world. So this is a universal, horrible thing that is coming out of this virus for Asians and Asian Americans.
So, fear breeds a lot of things. Is where, when people talk about the nexus of where people were feeling this, some people were saying, well, these were people who already felt racism towards Asian people or Chinese Americans, and now it just has a platform? Or are these new feelings being bred through the fears of the coronavirus? We do talk of it starting in Wuhan and people putting blame on one country versus another. I mean, where is the nexus of where all this begins?
Well, it's funny, Claudine, because I think you're right. Fear does breed a lot of this kind of action that may or may not be justified, right? And in this case, I think it's a combination of both. I think what this has allowed people who already felt this way towards Asians and other people of color, right? You always want to find a reason to play the blame game or put your hostilities towards something. And so in this case, this time, it's our turn. It's the Asians, it's we're to blame for this, even though we're really not. Yes, the virus did originate from China, but viruses and illnesses are born everywhere around the world, right? So you can't blame the people, it's just the disease. And then what's happening now is, because of this growing fear, people who may not have felt this way towards Asians or anything Asian related are also beginning to behave this way, which makes it worse because it's just growing. It's like a cancer that just keeps on growing.
And is accepted, right? I mean, I've worked in other parts of the country where there were very few Asian people, very few Chinese people. And so some of it I felt was, I had to put it in categories, right? There's malice behind it? Is it ignorance? Is it people, I had someone saying, who eats Chinese food for breakfast? And I said, well, like about 1 billion Chinese people eat Chinese food for breakfast. And some of that wasn't coming from a bad place, but a place where they don't understand. And so you have images coming out of China and wet markets and things like that. And there has been, and I've seen this, play out a lot where people, there is a lack of understanding of really where pictures reside in the global context, in a cultural context, in economic, socioeconomic context.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a cultural misunderstanding and a lack of knowledge for sure. Look, I don't expect every person who has never been exposed to Asian culture or Asian tradition to understand, right, how things work. That's where education and information are so powerful. The more people are informed and the more people are presented with different information, and they become more open-minded. But sometimes I say to people, look, I grew up in Ohio, right? In the 70s and 80s. So it was a difficult place to grow up as an Asian because there were no Asians.
Right.
So I was always the other. I was always considered this, foreigner, even though I was born in America. And so I couldn't, when I look back now, I can't really blame them per se because they were never exposed to Asian culture, to, the differences. So unless we can present our culture, to a broader audience and cultivate a better understanding, people are just never going to know. So they're going to just draw their own conclusions, right? And that's where the racism comes from, and the bias and all of that misunderstanding.
Well, yeah, I worked for 5 years in Indiana, but I was also raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I went to UCLA, and it was at UCLA, I actually think, where I got the "What are you? Where were you born?" And I would say Oakland, California, and they're
Yeah.
like, "Where were your parents born?" I'm like, "Well, San Francisco, California,"
Right.
and that was always an ongoing debate, in terms of people and what they were allowed to say, what they were allowed to ask, and then how I was reacting to it in large part, and so I guess the other debate is how much our leaders, our political leaders, play into that. With the president, he has stopped referring to coronavirus as the Chinese virus, but there were the stories that came out about the references at the Kung flu and things like that. How has that, from the people that you've talked to, changed the conversation and influenced the conversation about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in terms of how we create an environment where hate is not the fallback?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have a very strong opinion about this, as do a lot of my viewers and listeners of the show, as well as the broader Asian community. Unfortunately, yeah, the top leadership, President Trump, started all of this by saying, constantly on a repeated basis, calling it the Chinese virus, and then doubling down every time he was challenged in the press conference, where millions of viewers were watching this. So therefore, that kind of rhetoric just started sinking in, right? It's that repetition that starts sinking in. And so then you heard that on the streets, people, pointing to Asians saying Chinese virus, go back to China. So, leadership has to play a role in setting the tone. And unfortunately, the tone was set in a very negative way in the beginning. Yeah, you mentioned, Claudine, that 2 weeks ago, maybe it was less than 2 weeks ago, in a press conference, he finally read a statement saying that we have to protect our Asian American friends. I say day late, dollar short, because the message had already been sent through and compounded many times and accepted by people who are already, wanting to push this kind of agenda forward, this negativity and this racism. So
what about the people who argued, hey, we believe that it originated in Wuhan, China, that if MERS originated in the Middle East, that it's okay to say that the swine flu, that it was simply a geographical distinction as opposed to a blame game. I mean, that was the argument on the other side, to say he didn't say, oh, it's the Chinese virus and all bad viruses come from China, but he was saying, I'm just saying something factual. Do you think there is it's a plus B equals C, or it's a maybe could have been a just an end result of something that wasn't the main goal of a statement like that?
Right. No, I mean, I wish I could say that I believed that Donald Trump was only suggesting it was a geographical reference, but his track record, proves that he is not somebody who actually believes in, equality and racial justice and being, objective about things. So that's my issue with him, is that he had a very distinct target in terms of blaming an entire ethnicity. So, in the past, we have called different things by their geographical location. Ebola was, that was named after a river in Africa, right? But even the experts now are saying, the scientists, the researchers who do this kind of work and research these diseases, they even say now, really the naming of these diseases should be rethought because of the result that we're seeing. So that's why Dr. Fauci, in an interview, he adamantly said, I have never referred to it as a Chinese virus. And the reporter said, and will you ever? He said, no, just flat out no, because he knows what the negative repercussions are by saying that. So when people say, well, it's the Chinese virus, what that kind of wording suggests is that it comes from the Chinese people, Chinese. right? And so therefore, that's why we're suffering this backlash. I'm Korean, right? And so it just doesn't matter because we still now are seen as the same, right? You
Right.
look Asian, you're Chinese. Go home, go back to China. Take your virus with you.
Right.
And that,
And for Asian Americans in general, I think that's been a very difficult situation, especially, you know, I'll explain to people, I'm like, while I have wanted to go, I have never actually been to China.
yeah,
I don't speak Chinese. I wish I had, I wish I did. But, you know, when people say, you know, what is your nationality? I identify as American. I always have, my parents always have. And to have that questioned it creates a very difficult situation. But that makes me want to talk about Andrew Yang's recent op-ed in the Washington Post that is getting a
yeah,
lot of attention. I want to bring up one of the quotes from it because this is just one of the things he said, but I'll put it up full screen if we can see it there. And it
yeah,
says, we Asian Americans need to embrace and show our Americanness in ways we never have before. We need to step up, help our neighbors, donate gear, vote, wear red, white, and blue, volunteer, fund aid organizations, and do everything in our power to accelerate the end of this crisis. We should show without a shadow of a doubt that we are Americans who will do our part for our country in this time of need. Now, I got to tell you, when I read this op-ed, my reaction, and I want to get you to weigh in on this, but I didn't, I said to someone, I'm like, I didn't realize I had to prove it that I was an American. I didn't realize that that was on me to show my Americanness. And of course, that is the backlash that he's gotten from a lot of the community, not just the Asian American community, but saying, and making that analogy to World War II and saying, well, Japanese Americans signed up and yet
yeah.
tens of thousands were still interned. It didn't prove anything to the people who thought Japanese Americans were a threat to this country.
Right, right. Well, Claudine, I had the same reaction as many people did, especially those in the Asian American community. Yeah, he's basically saying that it's conditional, right, for us, that to be American as Asians, we have to prove it, that we have to qualify it somehow, that we have to show, we have to go beyond, you know, the average American to show that we're really American and that we belong here, that we deserve to be American. And to do that, we have to do all these extra things. I'm certainly not suggesting that volunteering and helping organizations, yeah, we should all be doing that anyway. Even if you're not American, you know, that's just a human thing to do. But he's drawing this parallel saying, to be more American as Asians, we have to do these things. Therefore, people are going to look at us differently and it will be accepted. That is the most god-awful message I can possibly come up with, you know, to try to convince people that this is how we're going to be okay. And this is how we're going to combat racism. I honestly, I'm just going to be flat out truthful. It was the most idiotic thing I've ever read, really.
Well, he addressed to, if we remember, the Saturday Night Live comedian who was hired, who was then, before he even started, yes, he was fired because the YouTube videos came up where he was making a lot of Asian jokes, racist jokes about food, and about saying that you can make racist jokes against the Asian community. That's acceptable.
Yeah.
I don't know if he specifically said the Chinese community, but I had watched a few of those. And Andrew Yang said in this op-ed, he said, I don't think that guy should have been fired either.
Yeah.
So he definitely has a position, I think, that surprised a lot of people, because especially as he took the stage as a presidential candidate, people were saying the first, you know, Asian American candidate and the first person. And I think that maybe why it took so many people by surprise. Or maybe you don't think, you weren't surprised?
No, I mean, I understand what you're saying. And I think maybe, yeah, people were surprised because he was supposed to be this guy who was breaking barriers, you know, by running for president. And, you know, he had quite a following with the Yang Gang and all of that. I myself, no, I'm not surprised. And I'll tell you why. From the beginning, I was happy to see that somebody of Asian heritage was trying to run for president. I was like, wow, that's quite a breakthrough. But soon after, I didn't like the way he was presenting himself and really playing up the stereotype of an Asian, the math pin. I'm the scariest thing to Donald Trump is an Asian guy who loves math. That was always his tagline. And to me, I was like, he's perpetuating this Asian stereotype that we're all good at math and science and that we're all super smart, and we follow the rules and we're the model minority. And those are the stereotypes that, I think the white majority and non-Asians, kind of look at us that way. What also follows with that is we're submissive. We don't make waves. We won't push back. So therefore, again, those stereotypes work against us, especially at a time like this. That's why people are like saying, oh, we can beat up on the Asians. We can say whatever we want. We can say these racist things because they're not going to fight back. Guess what, Claudine? What I have realized, and that's why I keep on speaking up about this very vocally, is that Asians are saying, no, enough, enough of these stereotypes, enough of us just staying silent. We cannot do this anymore.
So then how do you fight back against what's happening right now? What are the steps of what people are talking about? Because there is fear. I've heard from people who say, and I see videos and they can be as simple as someone, yelling someone at something across the street but they can obviously be much more. I know there was a comedian who recently went out and in response to this op-ed, right, wore red, white, and blue and
Jenny Yang.
Yes, and handed out, antibacterial wipes with a sign that said, "Now will you not hate crime me?" And I watched her post on that, and she obviously is responding with a little bit of humor and satire and saying, this is really, and that's her way of doing it. When you're hearing from your viewers and your listeners and people who are saying, how do we combat this?
Yeah.
What's the discussion about?
Well, I'll tell you, Claudine, I mean, every day I get messages from viewers and listeners about what's going on. And it's everything from total fear and anxiety. They don't want to go out because they're afraid of what's going to happen, to people who are being even more extreme, talking about guns, right? So it's that kind of huge sort of extremism that I'm seeing and witnessing from the Asian community. But the one theme that's now coming out, and for me, that's why I've been talking about this for weeks, about what's happening to our community, is the fact that we do need to speak up more. I called out the Asian community about 2 weeks ago in an episode, especially really high profile, well-known Asians in entertainment, media, etc. I noticed that a lot of them were not saying a word. They were not using their platforms and their influence to say anything about what was going on. And, it was disappointing enough for me to talk about it on the show. And so I said, listen, if not now, this is one of the biggest crises we're facing as a community. If not now, when would you speak up for us? When would you finally raise your voices about something that matters, if not now? And so I got a lot of feedback after that show, pretty much everybody agreeing with me. And so I feel like we have to really start speaking up and be courageous about this. This is how movements start. This is how civil rights started, right? This is what happened when Vincent Chin was killed in 1982 in Detroit, Michigan. And it galvanized a movement, not just of Asian Americans, but it galvanized all of the groups of people of color to come together and unite.
It's an interesting thing. When I talk to people about racism that I've experienced in my life, when people ask, "Oh, come on, have you felt anything?" Do you think? And this is what I just see from the perspective where I sit, especially in my time in the Midwest, where the Asian population and the Chinese population was fairly non-existent in the place where I worked. While I was treated really well, that it was just a lack of understanding. I have friends, and obviously, who talk about when they explain the African American experience and the racism that they endure, whether it's the person that clutches their purse tighter when they stand behind them at the ATM or the grocery store, or whether they get followed around in a store because they automatically are assumed, that they are going to steal something. Or I have friends in the Latino community who, they said they drive nice cars and they always get pulled over because it's assumed that it's not their car. when I explain the Asian American experience or the racism that I have felt, I said, well, that doesn't happen to me. No one clutches their purse tighter when I'm standing behind them. But people do talk loud and very slow to me. They ask me what I am. They compare me to a China doll. They do a lot of things that are demeaning, but that explaining that to people has been a part of the discussion, as opposed to the anger of just saying this is wrong. That understanding of why is it wrong. A lot of people, well, I'm calling you a China doll. That's a compliment, and why I don't. It's like explaining why Oriental is not a term that we would want someone to use anymore, or why saying what are you, or saying, well,
where are you from?
Where are you from? Or or what's your
from?
nationality? Are you Chinese? And and what and but going back to the discussion of ignorance versus racism is part of the standing up and speaking about it, because the Asian American population in the United States is 5% or less. I think I saw anywhere between 3 and 5%. It is a small number in terms of a minority number. And even in the Midwest, someone told me that I wasn't a minority.
Yeah.
And because she's like, you pass for white, which I had said to her, I'm like, well, seriously, no one ever in my life has mistaken me for being white. But because the population there was African American and white, this person wanted to put me in a category that she understood.
Right.
How much of this conversation of people speaking out is also opening up to the experience, and to say, this is what you might not see as part of the world in which I live.
Yeah. I think a lot of it has to do with that, is that, like that example that you just shared about people just kind of saying, oh, well, you're kind of white, you're kind of one of us, right? I had a really interesting conversation with a researcher just last week on the show about why the Asian experience is different from the African American experience, right? And that is because, again, because of the model minority myth, it's like, we've been shaped into this group where we're accepted as long as we follow rules and do the right thing. But then it can switch on a dime, which it has with this virus, right? Now, all of a sudden, we're the enemy, right? And so that kind of situational experience for Asians, it makes it difficult to, figure out, okay, are we in? Are we out? Are we good or are we not? Are we the enemy or are we accepted? Right. And so that makes the experience even more confusing to us, as well as, the white population, because they're trying to put us in a category, but then it all of a sudden changes. So we become the enemy. So it's this very fluid, undefined kind of racism sometimes. So that makes it really difficult. And I think, with the way in which we have to, educate is, again, how many people do you think really know about the Chinese Exclusion Act? How many people do you think know about the Vincent Chin murder, right? That sort of changed everything. How many people know about these different historical events that have happened to the Asian community? Not a whole lot of people. So therefore, when you tell them this stuff, people are like, really? Oh, I didn't know that, right? So they can't they can't have empathy until they know that these are situations that have happened in history, and now they continue to happen right now. I mean, we're living history right now. This is probably going to go down in the history books as a terrible time, for the Asian community.
I think it's interesting too, as we look globally, I've seen some, and I don't know the validity of them. And if I'm frank, were a quick glance on social media of also hate crimes against Asian people in other countries, that have popped up. What's interesting to me too is that I went to Europe for the first time when I was in college, and from 100 yards away, people were like, "Oh, you're an American. Oh, you're an American." They knew, just based on, I guess, how I carried myself or what mannerisms I had that were culturally American, that they could identify in Europe. And I remember having this moment saying, I felt like this extreme loneliness, because I came back to the US, and people continued with the "what are you?" And I remember thinking, there's literally nowhere on this planet that I can go that I'm 100% accepted for just being an American.
Yeah.
Chinese American, hyphenated, whatever. And I look at these other places in the world that are experiencing it. Do you get a sense of this is not a US problem, this is a global problem, or is it hyper focused in the US because of the diversity and the melting pot of which our country was built, that we have a lot of different ethnicities that we are merging together, and maybe more education needed on a lot of those fronts?
Yeah, I wish I could say that it was maybe just an American problem, which is not a great thing to say because I mean we're here.
Right.
But I have lived in several different countries because of my journalistic career and have traveled a great deal. I think I've been to about 55 countries so far. And unfortunately, I have been faced with, racism as an Asian everywhere. And I was even, I'll tell you this unbelievable story. I was visiting Auschwitz um, and in Poland, and I was there. Obviously, you can imagine, very somber environment. You're there to,
Mm-hmm.
understand what happened and the horrific, that horrific period in history. And my friend and I were inside the cafe there because it was quite cold that day, and we're getting some coffee. And I was at the counter. There's a group of teenage school kids who were there on a school trip, and they're Polish kids. And a group of these kids were at the counter with me, and they actually started doing the ching chong 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 thing to me at Auschwitz. I was so incensed that I called the teacher over and I told her to bring her entire class to my table. And I said, "You will translate everything I say." And I then started saying, "You are in a place where millions of people were killed for who they were, no other reason. And you are now making fun of somebody else because of who I am, the color of my skin. You need to learn a valuable lesson here that you cannot mistreat people for just because of their ethnicity or their religion or their background." And I mean, I literally sat there kind of shaking because I was so emotional. And the teacher very kindly translated everything. And these kids were literally like dead silent. So that I use as an example of it can happen anywhere, and it's racism and ignorance is bred everywhere, right? Again, if we want to just talk about the Asian population, I think the commonality in these experiences is that there is an overarching idea that Asians are, in general, docile, right? That we don't want to fight back, so we'll take it. We'll take any kind of abuse or any kind of negativity or criticism because we will just keep our head down. We want to just fit in, and we don't want to make waves. So I think there's a pervasive attitude overall globally about that.
But how hard has it been to get people to speak up, to fight against that particular stereotype before
wow.
you can fight against the other stereotypes?
And you know what it takes? It takes better representation in all fields, right? And that's why, as shallow as it sounds, media, entertainment, things that are really high profile, those are the ways that we are going to try to help break those stereotypes, through storytelling, through entertainment, through movies. And again, that sounds so shallow, but it really isn't, because those are the ways that people get reached the most, right? The bigger audiences, more eyeballs can watch the movie that presents Asians in a different way. Crazy Rich Asians, Parasite. It's so funny. I mean, I'm sure you've thought about this too. Only a few months ago, Asians were on a high, right? Parasite had swept the Oscars, and we were saying, "Oh my God, we have finally arrived. We're being recognized for our achievements, and we're not being seen as, these weird foreign Asians." And then bam, I mean, it was like, I got whiplash. And then all of a sudden this virus hits, and now we're the enemy and being seen as, just like these outsiders. So, but I do feel like if we can continue to try to increase representation in all areas, but especially those areas that are a little bit more high profile, so that people can be exposed to our stories, to our culture, and to the fact that we're not in this one category of this stereotypical Asian, that will help change the narrative.
Well, I did. You mentioned Crazy Rich Asians, and people who know me know that that movie was, I've watched it a gazillion times, and I loved it because it broke so many stereotypes. It wasn't the scientist or the guy who was good at math, and it was the good looking guy that everyone wanted to date, and the super rich and the super crazy. And it was just a fun movie that just happened to have a cast of people who were
Exactly.
all Asian, and that, you know, with a couple of exceptions, but not very many. And that was really, I mean, and it was just it was a fun movie. And I think what you said about breaking down stereotypes, I think, you know, we talk about the flattening the curve with coronavirus, and getting out of this and getting to the point where we build back up. I wonder how we flatten the curve in this. I mean, like you said, everything has ups and downs, right? And if this is the down and it flattens, and then we build back up, and maybe we took 2 steps back, but we had taken 3 steps forward with Parasite, with Crazy Rich Asians, with people having more acceptance and understanding of different cultures. Also with that movie, having the Chinese American experience also explained very well, that you may look the same here, but you're different here, which was one of my favorite moments in that movie, because it spoke really to me as someone who is born here and feels that same way. When do we flatten the curve with the animosity that we feel that the Asian American community is feeling now?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question, Claudine. In fact, I think about that every day. And the reason why is because my fear is that we have definitely gone backwards, with all the progress that we had made. And I think this is going to be really a tough climb back up. I'm being a realist here. I don't think all of a sudden, just because the virus goes away, this, you know, shift in questioning us and being suspicious and all of that is just going to vanish. You know, it's not. I think we've sustained some damage for sure, on both sides. On the side of the Asian Americans and Asians around the world, I think we're always going to have a little bit more anxiety for a little while, you know, because we don't know if people are still going to hang on to this animosity. Particularly what I fear is that, even if we flatten the curve on the virus, which will happen, and it's starting to happen, it looks like there's some glimmers of hope. The economic and social impact is going to be very lasting. You know, we know this, right? This is just a fact. So that, I'm afraid, is going to cause more social unrest and more frustration. And that's where more of the blame is going to continue and maybe even increase. And so who's going to be on the receiving end of that blame and frustration? My fear is, again, you know, the Asian community, because they're still going to say, oh, you know, China caused all of this. So, I mean, I want to be much more optimistic about it, but I'm preparing for the fact that I think we're in for a little bit of a rough period. And I think our mentality is going to change for a little while in terms of how to deal with this.
Do you think anyone's dealing with it better than other people? I mean, we have seen, you know, Governor Gavin Newsom spoke out about it fairly early in California. Obviously, there's a large Asian American population in California, so he may be getting more feedback. You know, you have, you know, obviously the Pacific Rim and different places. And do you see it being addressed in more positive ways in certain areas of the country than others? I mean,
we did see the House caucus members from all the, you know, minority groups coming together, you know, making a declaration about, you know, the anti-Asian sentiment. So it's great that leadership is coming forward to really condemn this and support the community. So it's obviously one way that people are hearing about it more than they certainly were before. And that's why I did that. Like I said, I did that show calling people out, saying, you got to speak up about this. So it's great to see leadership do this. It's great to see, you know, people who are well-known speaking more about this. But in terms of, you know, what we can do moving forward, it's really, it might be a regional thing, sure, where there's a higher concentration of Asians. You know, this is a bigger topic. But I'll tell you, you know, the viewers who are listening and watching now, you know, what helps is everybody just raising awareness about it themselves. Because even in my social circles, I have both Asian friends and I obviously have non-Asian friends. And my non-Asian friends from several weeks ago, I started talking about this and I started saying, do you know what's happening? They had no idea. And now they're more in tune with it. They're much more sensitive about it. And they're talking about it. They're sharing with their friends. And they even give me feedback saying, yeah, my friends had no idea either.
Well, I
So
think, isn't it so that if it doesn't occur to them, then
no,
they may not spot it. And that's what I always tell people. I'm like, if you are in a room and you aren't feeling any racism towards people and it's not directed at you because you're not a person of color that may be the target of it, you may never know it's there. But I guarantee you the minorities in the room are feeling it, or they see it, or their radar per se is much more in tune to that it's happening. And I have friends who have said the same thing. I really had no idea. And they may not, the person who tells the one, my last name is Wong, as you can imagine, that has been the recipient of, I think I have heard every single Wong joke, and
yeah,
I have heard it 17 times, and that's an understatement.
yeah,
But people who are the one person who told that joke that one day, they're like, wow, you're super sensitive. And I will say, I'm like, I'm not super sensitive. I just am a little exhausted
mhm,
by, whether it was, I mean, and yeah, 16 Candles and growing up in that, if Long Duck Dong and that character and having the last name Wong, if that didn't um,
yeah.
make my
Well,
life a miserable place, then I don't know what
my
did.
last name is Lee, so I was always like, "Oh, is Bruce Lee your dad?" I mean, it's so. Again, going back to what we were saying earlier, there's still an attitude here where Asians can still be made fun of, and you can get away with it. It's like still okay, right? So that's
Well,
where
yeah,
again,
that's
we
what that Saturday Night Live comedian said. Exactly. Right.
yeah,
It is
exactly.
still okay.
And that's when, like, Oscar So White a couple years ago, Chris Rock made an Asian joke, even during Oscar So White campaign, and that was so tone deaf, right? So that tells us there's still work to do in terms of the Asian community finally saying. That's why I keep on saying, enough, enough. No, we can't be the butt of your jokes. You would never do this with other cultures, right? Especially African Americans, because they have fought back. They have been very vocal because they've come together to fight back and not make and say it's not okay. Still happens. I'm certainly not saying their experience is over. Certainly not. But that's evidence of, like, a community has to finally stand up for itself. Nobody else is going to do it for us. And that's what I've been saying to my listeners. You think other people are going to do that for us? No, we have to do it. And then that has the ripple effect to other cultures and other communities saying, oh, okay, got it. It's not okay.
It's not okay. Well, Maylee, I really appreciate this conversation. It is an important one to have as we continue to live together as a community and do it with love and without racism, without hate, without blame. And that has been a difficult thing to do these days, apparently.
Yeah,
So,
it sure has.
all
It
right.
sure has.
I
Here's the one thing.
definitely,
Here's the one thing I'm going to say. This virus has touched everyone. No one is not affected by this, right? So it has shown us that we're all the same at the end of the day,
at the end of
right?
the day, and we
So
all want to beat it.
yeah,
No,
exactly.
nobody is rooting for this virus.
No,
So
no.
let's stand together and root for each other instead. All right. Mei Lee, the host of the Mei Lee Show. Thanks so much. I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.